permission. They watched you longer than they admitted, not with suspicion, but with interest. They dressed as distance. You didn't challenge, didn't persuade, just worked. Precise, quiet, efficient enough to escape credit, focused enough to command results. But they didn't see value in stillness, not then, because their system rewarded volume, urgency, visibility, and you gave them none. They didn't fear you. They overlooked you, which was worse. You weren't framed as threat or savior, just background, someone who didn't compete, didn't play the games, so they assumed you couldn't win them. But you never tried, because power wasn't the goal. Clarity was. And clarity doesn't beg for spotlight. Every structure they built leaned on assumption that those who didn't want control lacked vision, that silence meant absence. But silence in your hands wasn't emptiness, it was observation. And observation is the first fracture in any false hierarchy. You weren't waiting, you were mapping. So they rose, they rotated, they made noise and traded influence and spoke over truth. And all the while you watched, unmoved, unnoticed, unshaken. Not because you lacked ambition, but because you knew the timing of power matters more than its weight, and theirs was always too early. You never stepped forward, you just never stepped away. And presence, when sustained long enough in a system built on distraction, becomes the only thing that can't be ignored. But by the time they noticed, you weren't standing at the edge of their structure. You were holding it up without asking once. They came to you slowly, one by one. Never directly, never with the words they should have used. It started with requests, then meetings, then permissions. They asked you to review, then to revise, then to decide. But you hadn't changed, only their perception had. The same silence they ignored now felt like gravity. The same calm they overlooked now read as authority. You didn't lean into it, didn't shift posture. You received it the way you received everything, with stillness. Because power to you wasn't opportunity, it was liability. Influence only matters when it's not reactive, and they only came to you when they had no other direction left. Their urgency wasn't respect, it was consequence. By then the system had started to tilt. The ones who rose fast had burned out. The loudest had tangled their own words. The confident had been exposed by pattern. What remained was structure without spine. So they turned to you, not because you demanded it, but because everything else had failed. You weren't flattered, you were accurate. You knew timing, you knew presence, you knew the kind of weight that comes only when no one else can carry it. So you didn't rush, didn't celebrate, you just adjusted, like a fault line preparing to shift without warning, without apology. They thought they were giving you power, but they weren't. They were just finally admitting it had always been yours. And they were the last to know. They began quoting your words, not the loud ones. You never had those, just fragments. Comments made in passing, phrases you left behind, buried in meetings no one remembered recording. Now they resurfaced, repeated, framed as insight, wisdom, direction. But they weren't new. You hadn't changed. They had. And the system, too brittle to admit its own blindness, rewrote you as if you'd only just arrived. You didn't correct them. You didn't accept it either. You simply kept your pace. Power wasn't a crown. It was pressure. And the weight of delayed recognition wasn't flattering. It was warning. Because once people believe you carry answers, they stop doing the harder thing, asking better questions. Now eyes followed your stillness. Silence felt like tension. A raised brow paused conversations. Your hesitation reshaped timelines, and all without force. Influence in your hands wasn't about command, it was about consequence. You had become the margin of error they couldn't afford, so they adapted, softened their tone, rehearsed clarity, not because they understood, but because they feared misunderstanding you. You saw it clearly. How attention shifted from ego to survival, how leadership became mimicry, but you didn't react. You never asked for this. And because of that, they gave it to you too late, not as a gift, as a shield, as if your presence alone could hold together a system already fraying at the edge. But you knew better. Systems that wait until silence becomes the only authority left are systems already speaking their last words. They tried to secure him, defined a role, drafted a title, gave him access, visibility, symbols of inclusion. But he didn't react. Titles meant orbit, and he'd never needed orbit. He moved straight, always had. Authority in their hands had been architecture, rigid, visible, ceremonial. In his, it was absence, the kind of absence that shapes behavior more than presence ever could. They scheduled him into their structures, brought him into decisions late, gave him the last word, not the first, a gesture they believed was generous. But what they didn't see was that the real decision had always happened in the space between their actions and his silence. He didn't override, he redirected. With a single glance, a pause before response, a refusal to confirm what they already knew was failing, and that was enough. The system adapted, not because he imposed, but because he was now the last stable point in a collapsing sequence. Stability, when everyone else performs, becomes leadership whether you want it or not. Behind closed doors, they called it organic authority, quiet influence. Words meant to make them feel in control of giving it to him. But they hadn't given anything. They had delayed too long, and what they called power now had already turned into dependence. And he saw it all, without claiming, without denying, just existing in the exact center of their exhaustion. Because when a system gives you control out of fear, what they're really giving you is proof that they've already lost it. They stopped asking for your opinion, not because it didn't matter, because it mattered too much. Every answer shifted timelines, every silence adjusted tone. They started checking their proposals against your posture, measuring risk by the way you folded your hands. You didn't speak more, they just heard more in the gaps. That's when it changed. They began to behave without being told, not out of trust, out of caution. Like walking across thin ice with a stranger standing on the shore, not moving, just watching. You didn't threaten them. You didn't need to. Power that isn't requested isn't questioned. It's absorbed. And you felt the shift, the subtle collapse of resistance, the slow bending of systems that used to resist consensus. Now they reached for it, through you, around you, because power, when earned by presence, doesn't invite loyalty. It provokes dependence disguised as respect. Some of them resented it. They should. It came too late, too passively. It arrived like a delayed apology, wrapped in urgency. They gave you the wheel only after the road had vanished. And still, you didn't grab it. You just sat there, anchored, until the weight of everything they'd broken made silence the only stable thing left. If you're still here, you already understand why they waited too long. Subscribe before they do it again. He began to feel it press in, not as invitation, but as weight, influence crystallizing around him, expectations woven into silence. They wanted him to decide, but never asked what it would cost, and he wouldn't explain, because explaining would sound like agreement, and agreement would lock him into a structure he didn't design. This wasn't what he came for. He didn't need power to function. He just needed space, time, autonomy. But now, every room reshaped itself around him. Every pause carried implication. Even neutrality was taken as guidance. When presence becomes too stable, it stops being interpreted as silence. It becomes signal. And that's when he knew this wasn't recognition, it was containment. They hadn't handed him control. They'd placed him in the center to stabilize what they'd already broken, like anchoring a failing bridge with a man who never wanted to cross it. They wanted his clarity, his patience, his weight, but not his intent, not the path that led him here, and especially not the reasons he never asked for this. They thought giving him power now was correction, but they were wrong. It was abdication, wrapped in urgency, delivered too late. He didn't push back. He didn't embrace it either, because real power, true presence, doesn't need to be claimed. It needs to be understood. And none of them ever asked what would happen if he simply stayed still long enough to let it all collapse again. They tried to build around him structures, language, chains of delegation. They hoped he'd step into the role they outlined, finally, officially, but he didn't move because he knew once you accept a crown handed to you in crisis, you don't get to choose what it means. So he stayed where he was. Let the weight circle him. Let the structure adapt to his presence like muscle around a foreign bone. They thought they were stabilizing the system, but they were just decorating collapse, because systems don't fail when no one's in charge. They fail when the one holding it together doesn't need the system at all. People started acting differently around him. Careful speech, deliberate tone, the kind of calibration reserved for rooms with thin walls. They called it respect, but it wasn't. It was surveillance without direction. They weren't afraid of him. They were afraid of what his silence said about their own relevance. He noticed how clarity became threat, how stillness became standard, how everything around him became defined by what he didn't say. And the more they shaped the structure to fit around him, the more obvious it became he wasn't the one inside it. He had stayed long enough for them to reveal who they became when authority wasn't loud. And now that they finally gave him what they thought he wanted, he understood something deeper. They didn't give him power. They gave him their fear, dressed as permission. They stopped asking for direction, not because they trusted him, but because they didn't trust themselves anymore. Every decision circled back to his presence, not his input, his weight. And weight, when unclaimed, becomes unbearable. They were no longer leading, they were orbiting. He felt it, the shift. How authority had collapsed into dependence. They weren't executing plans. They were avoiding misalignment with him. He hadn't spoken in days, and yet his absence from a meeting could reshape the tone of an entire quarter. Not because he blocked anything, but because no one wanted to move without his gravity to justify the motion. They built reports around his silence, crafted outcomes shaped like his logic. But the more they tried to think like him, the less they understood what kept him still. And that was the fracture. You can imitate what someone does, but not what they refuse to do. And refusal had always been his sharpest edge. Now, power sat across the table from him, polished, formalized, delayed. They offered him the last decision, the final word, a structure too late, too shallow, too designed to fix what only presence had kept from breaking. He didn't reject it. He didn't accept it. He just looked at it for what it was, a gesture made not to lead, but to delay collapse. Because now the structure didn't fear losing him. It feared proving he was never needed to begin with. He didn't touch the offer, let it sit, let the room fill with its own uncertainty. No tension, no threat, just stillness. And in that stillness they realized power, when delayed, doesn't arrive clean. It arrives with residue, with desperation, with too many fingerprints. They waited for an answer, one word, a nod. But he said nothing, not out of drama, out of finality. Because truth, once you've seen how long people delay it, becomes something heavier than power. And heavier than power is the knowledge of what you could do and choose not to. He saw what they had become, not corrupted, not evil, just slow, dependent on clarity they never cultivated. Now they called his detachment strategy, his silence, wisdom, his absence from conflict, control. They needed him to step in, not to lead, but to absorb the consequences of their delay. And that was the breaking point, not the offer, the expectation behind it, the quiet hope that he would still care enough to hold up what they had failed to build, that he would fix by presence what they had collapsed by design. But power never mattered to him, it only mattered to them. And they only offered it now because it had lost its value, and value, once lost in urgency, never returns clean. He left the offer untouched, not refused, not delayed, just left. Because true exits don't need announcements. They happen when the weight no longer belongs to you, and for him, the weight had already passed, not when they offered the power, but when they realized he never needed it. He walked through the structure one last time, not to say goodbye, not to leave a message, just to witness what remained. Walls still standing, people still working, systems still running, but everything moved around a hollow that used to be filled by someone who never asked to be seen. They would keep going, that much he knew. They'd rewrite the silence, reframe the absence, craft a narrative where he was always part of the plan. Because systems that fail to give power in time always pretend they did, just in a different way, just in a version of history where delay looks like design. He didn't stop them, didn't correct them. That wasn't his role, never had been. His presence was never about direction, it was about pressure. And pressure, when sustained long enough, does one thing better than power. It leaves a shape behind. And now that shape would stay, not as legend, not as warning, just as the quiet outline of someone who stood still until the entire system realized it was too late and then finally let it go.